Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
I'm delighted to welcome Simon Robinson to the Talent Equation. Simon, all the way from Tokyo, welcome.
Thank you, Stuart. Good to be here.
Great stuff. I think the starting point with all the shows is just to let people know kind of what you do and your backstory and why you do what you do today and your involvement in the sport you're involved with. It might also be a useful starting point to tell everybody what you're doing in Tokyo for a kickoff.
Yeah, for sure. Basketball is my discipline area, I guess you would say. And at the moment I'm over here participating in a couple of camps with the Japanese national intellectually disabled basketball teams. We had a national camp in near Nagoya last weekend. It was nice and warm, and there's another one coming up this weekend in Tokyo for their under-18s.
Brilliant. And so your backstory, kind of what got you involved in basketball? It's not exactly the national sport in Australia, is it? So what took you into that direction?
Well, I grew up with three brothers.
Right.
We were played pretty much. We're fairly close in age. We played pretty much everything there was to play: cricket, soccer, football, tennis, and so on. And then we all sort of hit high school, and everyone was playing basketball at high school, and we just all sort of took to it. I think I liked the mix of the individual and the team. It was non-contact, which kept mum and dad happy, so we weren't getting our heads beaten in, constantly playing rugby league or something like that. And I think it took off from there. I played all through high school, university, started coaching in university as part of the university team. We had an arrangement with one of the local schools. We used their facilities and coached their teams sort of as a way of trading off of the facility. Also ended up being able to do that to make a little bit of money. Junior rep stuff to improve my learning and things. Then got into a graduate diploma of education, and obviously within the school system continued doing a lot of coaching. My wife's job took her to Central Queensland at that stage, and it was up there that I through the coaching that I was doing met another coach who was at that stage the assistant coach to the men's ID team, the Australian men's ID team that was preparing for the 2000 Sydney Paralympics, and there were a couple of local players up there that I assisted to prepare for that, and as a result of that became involved in that area, and then coached the Queensland State ID men's team for a few years. We then relocated to Victoria. I did some juniors and some senior stuff for a little bit mainstream for a few years, and then when my children came along, the time demands for them meant that all of the stuff that I was doing I had to pull back on a little bit. Got involved in the ID scene again and coached the Victorian State men's team for 6 years. And through that got involved in the national program, coached there for for almost 6 years, I believe, and at the moment am involved with the Victorian Women's ID program.
Wow.
So that's it in a nutshell.
So you're pretty busy then.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say.
And is this? I'm assuming this isn't a full-time gig. There's a full-time job going on the side of this whilst you're doing all this coaching as well.
My full-time job at the moment is my two children.
That is a
But yeah,
full-time job.
it is. So I've been doing that full time for the last couple of years. While my wife's psychiatry, so she does. It's lucrative for her to do some locum and contract stuff. So she does that for most of the months of the year. I sort out the kids. So I resigned from my last teaching job, I think 2 or 3 years ago, where I was doing a lot of stuff in. So it was digital learning and a lot around improving teaching and learning in the classroom by improving the teaching and learning process. So working with teachers to improve pedagogy and all of that sort of stuff.
So I imagine your life, it revolves around quite a lot of. She comes home from whatever she's doing work-wise, and then you're going out to do the coaching stuff, and you're sort of like, kind of see you later and all that kind of stuff. Which I know is certainly an experience that most people I've talked to have probably had, but the other way around.
Yeah, ships passing in the night, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yes, she came back from a contract. She was home for a few days, and then I flew out to Japan. So. Yes, it was high and by.
High and by, exactly. Okay, so I mean, one of the reasons that you reached out to me was, I think the podcast I did with Alex Sarama, who is working over here in the kind of European MBA scene, and talking about using constraints in a basketball context. And I mean, what's super fascinating for me really is. Whilst I've done some work in my coaching career, working within disability sports, definitely an area I'm really passionate about. Not least of which because I was born with a disability myself. But most of the time, my time's been working able-bodied sport, and you're essentially working in largely, like you say, intellectual disabilities, and using a constraints approach within that context. So I think it's really interesting just to explore that. And I mean, I'd be really, really fascinated if you just tell us a bit more about kind of, firstly, I guess, what led you down the ecological approach or the sort of constraints approach, and then really it'd be really interesting just to sort of explore some of the approaches you take and all that sort of stuff, and how you engage with that group of participants.
Yeah, well, I think when I emailed you a couple of weeks ago, I think because I was thinking a lot about it. Like I have been very much drawn to the stuff that you've been talking about on your podcast, and a few others, and it just seemed to match almost exactly the approach that I've sort of evolved into, and I think how I expressed it to you when I emailed you was that when you're coaching, I think in the inclusion space, puts constraints on your coaching. And as a result of those constraints, I think it sort of almost guided me into a CLA sort of approach with the athletes. I mean, time is always a constraint. There's with any teaching and learning thing you do, time always seems to be a constraint. It's definitely even more of a constraint with the intellectually impaired athletes, because it takes a little bit longer oftentimes for them to grasp concepts or things of that nature. So a lot of it was around, and also the opportunities aren't there as much for these athletes to necessarily access the pathways that regular mainstream athletes would. So the time constraint was the start of it, and it was like, okay, so you're with these athletes for this period of time. How can you maximize and basically milk every last little bit out of that time to ensure that one, the athletes enjoy what they're doing, have a satisfying experience, hopefully feel some sort of sense of growth, learning, and achievement. And then in the longer term, how can you continue to assist them in improving as much as they possibly can, and in some cases even go to representative levels. And so for that, it just seemed to make a lot more sense that everything you did involved as many of the athletes as possible. And the best way to do that is by playing games effectively. You don't do any drills that doesn't involve offense and defense, for instance, because anytime you're doing offense only, you're losing an opportunity to practice your defense, and that saves you time and things of that nature. So I think that the time constraint was the big one that led me there to start with.
So, I mean, that's fascinating in itself. So you are working with athletes who, one of the key limitations is the time on task that you have with them, and so therefore your decision making there, or your decision making as a coach in terms of your effectiveness within the session time, is to say, right, well, we need to make this as rich as possible in terms of opportunities for action, decisions, all those sorts of things. And so therefore we're going to center our activity around, I guess, trying to create as realistic a scenario as possible within a training context in order to give them maximum exposure to the kinds of experiences that they're likely to encounter, and then you can explore within that. Is that a decent summary of kind of how that thought process came about?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, and then depending then on either the skill level of the athlete or the competency of the athlete, you then adjust the constraints within that space to fit their physical, cognitive, and emotional needs. So if you have very, very high functioning athletes, which I had when we have the national program. There's obviously the space can be more open and less constrained for them to explore more. With some of the lower functioning athletes, or if they're just beginners or quite young, you then constrain the space a little bit more to assist, so it's not as cognitively demanding, so they can still make decisions and experience some success. And also not as emotionally demanding, because obviously if the environment is too challenging for the athlete, it not only makes it difficult for them to learn, but then they become quite frustrated. And along with some of the ID athletes, along with some of the obviously the intellectual impairments, there also can be some emotional stuff that comes along with that. So keeping those sorts of things balanced is very important.
See, I think that's interesting. How so there's a number of variables there. I mean, I'm going to really love to dig into this with you for a little bit. Just as a starting point, though, because I think it's important probably to paint the picture here. In terms of the athletes you work with,
Yep.
What typically, obviously intellectual impairments take many forms, don't they? So typically, is it a wide range, or are you working with a specific impairment type, or how does that sort of work?
So at the top level, for international competition, which is qualifying for what I call INAS events, which is now effectively the international organisation that started up following the 2000 Paralympics to cater for international sport for IB athletes. Athletes need to test below 75 on an IQ test, like a WISC or something similar, and they need to be at a certain level. Their adaptive behaviours also need to be at a certain level, such as on a Vineland's or similar, for people who are working in that space, and that's assessed by a psychologist. And so that's the top level. As soon as an athlete, if you test above that, then you're not eligible. And that testing, the first lot of testing for that needs to have been done before the age of 18, so that it can be demonstrated that it was actually a developmental issue all the way through, as opposed to, say, a professional athlete at the age of 23 getting an acquired brain injury and then having the impairment following that. That's sort of the eligibility criteria. So at the top end, that's what you have, and so at an international level, you're looking for the highest functioning athletes in those. Guys that are really pushing at the ceiling of that, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
However, I work also coach at I guess you'd say a domestic, a local club not far from where I live, which is an all abilities group, and there we have grades ranging from very low functioning, low level athletes that require assistance to move around the court and understand how the game is played, all the way through to we have a couple of guys at the top grade who are playing, who have played internationally. So depending on obviously where the athletes are playing, depends on what they're up to. But so I work at a club level with can work with quite low functioning athletes, but then at a representative level work with quite high functioning athletes.
Okay. And in terms of the so it's a developmental impairment. It's not something that, like you say, is acquired because it's caused through an injury. You're
Correct.
not eligible if that happens. Is that right?
Well, so if it's an ABI, it needs to happen. The impairment needs to be identified before the age of 18. So they're the three criteria: before the age of 18, under 75, and adaptive behaviours. Yeah.
Okay, and then and can the impairment be caused by a range of different factors? So, for example, I'm just thinking, there's a whole series of reasons. It could be something to do, linked to disease, or it could be linked to, kind of a challenging kind of environmental things like that. Is there a range of reasons that the impairment exists, or is it generally, does that not really taken into account? It's just literally, if you meet these criteria, you're in, and then we just start working from there. Because what I'm wondering as well is, does some of the intellectual impairments also come with physical impairments, for example?
Yes and yes. So
okay.
Why the intellectual impairment is there is not particularly relevant.
Okay.
It just needs to be at a certain. There's just a bar that needs to be cleared, or perhaps not cleared. Yeah. And they qualify. It is not uncommon to have physical impairment that can come along with the intellectual impairment. However, obviously for performance reasons, if you're looking for elite athletes in that space,
yeah.
you're looking for elite physical, and definitely the guys on the Australian national team they're quite competent athletes.
Okay. All right. Sorry, that was just important. I think the context there is really important in terms of like the athlete that you work with and the kind of. So, I guess it might be worth, if you're happy to do this, sort of talking about kind of both domains, like the kind of more recreational club domain, which is probably the base of the talent pathway for many of these athletes. Some of them are maybe on this sort of talent development journey. Some of them are there recreationally, but then you've also got these kind of elite performers. Is your methodology more or less the same in both, or are you in terms of your approach, not necessarily the like you said, for a younger athlete, you might reduce the variables or what have you. But broadly speaking, are you adopting a kind of constraints-based philosophy, I suppose, in both domains? And I suppose it might be worth exploring what some of the differences are.
Yeah. Well, again, I find that I have converged to be having a very similar approach regardless of the level.
Right.
And the advantage of when you take a more of a constraints based approach is that you can dial it, provided you do the heavy lifting with regards to your thinking or analysis of of what it is that you think is important within whatever activity you're doing. If you do that heavy lifting beforehand and identify some useful games, activities, the D word, whatever however you want to describe them, then if you do a great job of figuring out what that thing can be, then you can just dial it in depending on the level of the athlete. I mean, at a very, very low level, sometimes we get some of the guys on the autistic spectrum can come in either quite young, or they're coming in and they're cognitively impaired as well as physically impaired. You need to make some adjustments, but they're sort of the special cases, if you will. But the advantage, like as you said, as we sort of said at the top, I found that I was doing quite a lot of coaching quite a lot of teams. I coach my kids' teams. I've got 2 young kids, so I'm coaching them. I had at one stage had the national program, the state program, and also the local ID club stuff that I was doing as well. And it just seemed to make sense for me. Again, my constraints were, I only had so much time to be able to juggle all of these things. So trying to be as efficient as possible was always the forefront of my mind. And as you said, setting up some activities and dialing the constraints up and down to suit the level of the athletes, I found to be very time effective. And as it turns out, also, very effective from a teaching and learning perspective.
I have to say that really resonates with me, because I guess maybe that's one of the reasons I was leading you to that question. By the way, I love the way people come on this podcast and say the D word. It kind of sort of makes me laugh, really, but because
it's a meme now, Stu. Come on, man, you got to own that.
Yeah.
The D word, hashtag Stu.
Yeah. I think it's gonna sort of follow me wherever I go, I guess. It'll probably be an epitaph. Anyway, what was I going to say? Yeah. So, was because I think I found myself in the same scenario. So I'd be working with national age group players, be working with club players, and I would do something really quite similar. But like you say, I would be either dialing up or down the variables or the rules or some of the limitations on space or whatever it might be to suit the ability of the athlete. But the concept that we were working towards would be very similar. And partly that was an efficiency thing, because a bit like I've got lots of other things happening, and so planning time is at a premium. But it's not just because it's I don't want anyone to go away with the impression that it's lazy. It's just that that this group are working on a concept and this group are working on a concept, and the likelihood is that the format or the activity that you're going to embrace is going to be very, very similar. But your approach in terms of how you tackle those individuals, either on an individual basis or in terms of the the support you give them, or the challenge point that you provide for them, is going to be different. But broadly speaking, the activity itself has some very, very common principles and themes. So definitely that resonates for me. And what I found was that it was actually really useful. I would often take something I'd learned from one session, even in the national age group, and go, well, that's really interesting. I'm going to apply this locally. And I'd work the other way around as well. So sometimes the kids I'm working with, like, the under 12s I might be working with on a Wednesday night, that's almost like my experimental kitchen. So I'll go in there and go, right, let's see what, let's sort of concoct a recipe in this context and see what happens with the dish. And if it comes out and it tastes okay, I'll go, that's really useful. And I can take that now to my national age group and then tweak it in a different way for them. And, I'm confident that I've got something that's going to be that's going to resonate with them as a group. Interestingly enough, though, I've actually found the opposite sometimes works, and usually it's not the way you'd think. So people would normally think that the national age group level wouldn't translate down to a club level, but actually it does. What I've found is that club level stuff doesn't translate to national age group, because actually the national age group are actually usually a bit more fixed in their thinking about what they can and can't do. So it's been quite interesting just to have that. I don't know whether you've had similar experiences.
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, to go back, I mean, as an example, well, what I have found is quite useful, and really it's quite a privilege to be able to be coaching at both ends of the spectrum at the same time. I think it gives you a tremendous amount of clarity around what's actually important from a developmental perspective. When you can see the issues that are perhaps facing, an elite athlete or just a sub-elite athlete at sort of towards the end of that development journey, and athletes that are just starting out on it, because then you can take what you see at the end and start to think about, okay, this is a big problem for this or this group of athletes at this particular point in time. How can we actually, is there a way for me to head that off at the pass and have an intervention? What could have happened, like the sliding doors thing? Is there something that could have happened in the past that maybe would have caused these athletes to avoid having that particular block or issue, or as you say, fixed mindset around whatever that thing is? And being able to compare and contrast at either end of the spectrum, I think, is really, really valuable. I mean, when I was teaching, I was a physics major, maths minor, so taught science and mathematics at high school, and there's a lot of very interesting stuff around assumptions you make about how students understand different sorts of things. So by way of parallel, went to a conference once. It was the most eye-opening thing around mathematics, where the person said that, well, they've actually done they've done these studies and surveys on the equal sign, and they found out that since the advent of calculators, a significant enough proportion at that stage, something like 30 to 35% of students, didn't actually know what the equal sign meant. They thought that equal meant do, because when you punch numbers into a calculator, like 23 plus something or other or something, you put in all these numbers and these operations, and then the equal sign, they assumed it was like the enter key on a keyboard for a computer, which meant do it. They didn't understand that equals actually meant equal, meaning the same. And that becomes a problem when they go to do algebra, because when you're trying to rearrange things in an algebraic equation, you need to do the same thing to both sides, because both sides need to be the same.
Yeah.
So knowing that there can be that fundamental misunderstanding at an early age, being able to go back and emphasize that in primary school is tremendously valuable to head off a lot of problems that occur when students try to do algebra, say, in high school. And so, I've found the same thing to occur with athletes. And so I go back and coach some of the developing kids or the lower ability kids, and they make decision errors. And I ask them, so what are you looking at? Where are you gathering information to make that decision? And they'll give you some information that comes back, and then you go to national team camp, and these kids then the athletes make the same mistake. And I'm like, now hang on a tick. You ask them the same question, you get the same response, and you're going like, right. That then is something that needs to be addressed all the way through, right from the beginning, all the way through to the end. So it's really powerful, that stuff, I think.
So you're actually picking up really useful clues, I suppose, from those developing athletes as to, kind of how they're perceiving their sporting world, that you're then able to translate to athletes who are working, or even test that out with athletes working in the international space. And often you're finding that there's quite a strong correlation, because developmentally, they've had a probably similar journey, perhaps that hasn't given them the as many opportunities to be exposed to game-like scenarios as others, and so therefore they're not attuned to the perceptual variables in just the same way as a developing athlete isn't. It's just that they haven't had that exposure level either. Is that sort of how it sort of manifests?
Yeah, and it's well, as you often talk about, as do other guests on the pod, talk about how really what is sport. Sport often just provides these series of problems that are there to be solved, and the challenges come when the athletes either come across a problem that they haven't solved before or haven't seen, or the tools that they are currently using to solve that problem no longer work for whatever reason. And so what I find is when the athletes go up through the pathway, things change. The game changes. It gets faster. The athletes get bigger. Because everyone's getting bigger and faster, effectively the space gets smaller because the athletes can cover more space, with either through length, height, or speed. And so when athletes jump from, say, a domestic level to a representative level, or from a representative level to a state level to international, all of a sudden the tools that they were using to solve those problems no longer work, because they're no longer the fastest player on the court. They're no longer the tallest player on the court anymore. So now they need a different solution. But that problem doesn't surface until they're in that until they go up to that next level. And so for them, they haven't had to gather that little bit of extra information. They don't have to see the defense behind their defender, because up until now they've been fast enough and tall enough to be able to beat their player and get to the rim before the help can arrive, for instance. Whereas now all of a sudden at international level, okay, you can beat your guy off the dribble or whatever, use some action to get space and get open, but now that space is closing down quicker than it has in the past, and that puts you under pressure. And they make mistakes or wrong decisions and so on and so forth. So sometimes having athletes who aren't as fast, I guess, what is it? They're effectively in a similar difficulty space. Their challenge point is the same. So they're not playing at the same level, but their challenge points sort of match, if that sort of makes sense. And that can be, drawing those parallels can be really, really helpful. And then talking to the athletes about that.
Again, though, you've touched on a fascinating subject area, which is, it's one of the reasons why I've always been quite fascinated by the way some sports have really embraced the idea of kind of modified game forms for children, in order to somehow kind of equate the spatial constraints that adults would face. So, there was that famous video that was done in ice hockey where they got the adults to play on a pitch that was the equivalent size that children would play on, so it was like double or triple the normal size. And they were all going, this isn't any fun. It's far too tiring. We can't really play properly, and this, that, and the other. And then, saying to them, well, why do we insist that children have to play on a full-size hockey rink? And it's similar. So in my mind, it's like, it makes total sense that you might want children to play in basketball on a smaller court with a shorter basket height.
Lower hoop, yes.
Exactly, lower hoop, to equate the experience they're likely to have with adults, which then means that the pictures that they're going to see and the problems they're going to need to solve and the action choices they take as a result of what they're seeing will then translate upwards as their height and size and speed increases up to the kind of full adult game. But the opposition you get to the suggestion of doing something like that, it's not proper basketball, it's not proper rugby, it's not proper football, it's just bewildering, that that you get any opposition to that. But I think that some of that stems from the fact that people think that sport is an aggregation of techniques. I'm taking you down a rabbit hole. We can go back to that in a minute. But I'd just be interested to get your thoughts on the kind of court size, hoop height, all that sort of thing.
Oh, you had to go there, man. Come on.
We'll go
dude, seriously, preach. You know, like, it's one thing. So my eldest is now 11, going on 12. Youngest has just turned 7, and going back and starting at under 8s and so my son, because he was just mad keen about, you know, balls and bats and all this sort of stuff. So he started, you know, playing quite early at sort of age 6, and it's just so what. Yeah, I just completely agree. I have so many. I've had this conversation so many times. I just don't know where to start. What you find with little kids, obviously, especially in a game like basketball, they can only throw the ball, like, you know, a couple of meters when they first start to play.
Yeah.
Some of them can't even catch it.
Yeah.
So if you can only throw the ball that far, this enormous space just becomes so intimidating. And then what happens is everybody ends up playing on a tea towel, because there's no, like, so one kid will run to space, but there's no point in running to space if that space is so far away that no one can actually throw the ball to you, because the whole point, like, and it's where the approach I take with the young kid, well, all of the athletes, is like, how is the game actually played when you have the ball, when you don't have the ball, when you're on defense guarding the ball, when you're defense and you're not guarding the ball, those sorts of things. You know, like, you're trying to create a pass, you're trying to create opportunities, you're trying to create an advantage for your team. And so the kids run to space and they go, oh, but, you know, whoever it is that has the ball can't get the ball to you because the ball's too heavy, you know, things like that. And it's just, and it I think it has a tremendous impact on the development of the athletes. I think it has a tremendous impact on how the game is played. And I think it's had a huge impact in Australia on how they approach juniors, especially in Victoria, on our teams all the way even through to an international level.
Simon, bear with me a second. I've just got somebody at the door. Bear with me. Stay there.
Yeah, man. Go for it.
Sorry about that. I should have known. We're going on holiday next week, and needless to say, there will be several deliveries arriving today as my wife creates the holiday wardrobe. Anyway, where were we? That's not going in the podcast. I get into trouble.
We'll fix that in post. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off mid-flow. Where were we?
That's right, man. I'm just seeing if I can start my. I don't have video. You can't see me, can you?
No.
Just figure that out.
There you are.
Hey, here we go. Hey, it's my stream fast enough. Yeah, no, it's. I mean, one of the biggest issues. I think it's changed a little bit now, but one of the biggest issues in the past with Australian basketball is we couldn't shoot the ball. And we always had this thing of, like, we wanted to be this aggressive defensive team and running and doing, and you know, that's fine, you can be that, but you know, I start thinking, like, where does that come from? It's not until you coach juniors and you find out that at under 8s, under 10s, under 12s, like that before kids hit that, you know, the adolescent sort of development spurt, the early blooming kids dominate, but everyone's still too short, right? So everything's about speed. So if you have the fastest athletes, you just win, like, all the time, because it's just a horse race up and down. It's just a track meet, as the Americans would say. And then what do you do if you've got the quickest kids? Well, you just flood any space with all your players. because no one on the court can throw the ball over half court.
Yeah.
So you know that half of the court is not usable.
Yeah.
That, you know, like the constraint is the physical abilities of the kids. You know, no one can throw from one corner diagonal to the other corner of a half court. So all of this, the space, while it's not constrained by the lines, effectively the usable space is constrained by the physical abilities of the athletes. So you flood that space, and you just take the ball off the other team and shoot.
Yeah.
But because you're flooding their front court, you're just shooting layups. You're not actually required to use space. You're not actually required to read much. You're not actually required to make many decisions necessarily. You're just stealing the ball and shooting a bunch of layups. And that serves you very, very well early on. However, what I think we found over the past few years, especially with like under 16s, 18s, or what are they, 17s, 19s, 23s, you go and play in Europe, they just zone, they slow the game down, and they can just shoot from anywhere. So they just spread you out and then shoot the heck out of it, and that makes it hard defensively. And then at the other end, because in the past we haven't been great shooters, they just pack the paint with length, and they dare you to shoot the ball. And if you shoot poorly, you lose. And I think that's been something. And there's been steps taken over the last few years now to sort of address that. But at a junior level, it's still, I think it's still really bad. I mean, I know in Melbourne, Victoria, they're just tremendously short of basketball courts. So you use any court that you can, and unfortunately that means that you're playing in school courts and things like that, and oftentimes the hoops can't go up and down, so you can't lower the hoops. I think they use that as an excuse to say, oh well, not all the courts can lower the hoops, so for the competition to keep it equitable, we won't lower the hoops. Which, and I'm sure your response would be the same. It's like, well, really, at under 8s, under 10s, under 12s, why are we really playing? Like, what are we really playing for? Does it need to be equitable to make sure that, oh, no, because people will complain because you played on this court and won or lost or whatever? Or should we really be going, well, wherever we can, we lower the hoops because that's in the best interest of the athletes developmentally? So if they can play with the lower hoops, they play with the lower hoops. If they can't, well, so be it. That's a constraint, and we're going to live with it. But we try to get them on those modified courts as much as possible, lighter balls, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, unfortunately, money also plays a big part, unfortunately. So, yeah, it's a hard one. It was interesting, though. There's a Basketball Victoria have a podcast that they've started bringing out, and it was encouraging to hear that a few of the people there are talking more about modifying the game for younger athletes. I think there's plenty of scope, especially for the younger kids, to play half court 3-on-3 as opposed to full court. That middle third of the floor for under 8s, under 10s is just it's just a waste. I think 3-on-3 you get more. You can play both half court either end. You get 12 kids on a court at a time as opposed to 10. You can have the coaches are closer to the action, so they can assist kids where they need to. And as you said, if you're in a facility that has lower hoops, now you've got 12 kids playing on low hoops as opposed to, I think that's just a much better way to go. But as you say, there's still, resistance. Change is hard. Whatever industry, I think.
It fascinates me, doesn't it? It fascinates me actually because not only does it make logical sense, smaller people, smaller space, smaller everything, smaller balls, lighter balls, everything else. Make it all, tennis is really interesting research done by Tim, or at least either by Tim Buzzard, or he was talking about it around tennis. And and I know also Ian Renshaw.
Lower the net, balls that don't bounce as high.
Yeah, smaller, exactly. So that actually the serve doesn't have to go up in order to go in. it can
It can
go
come
down.
down. Yeah.
Yeah. And then in terms of the receiver, they're obviously seeing something that they're more likely to see when they're older. The other thing that was interesting is like Ian Renshaw recently was, I know he was on TV in Australia launching, or partly launching and giving the kind of scientific background to potential changes made in Australian cricket around the shorter pitches and the smaller boundaries and different balls and these sorts of things.
Yep.
And it's just really interesting how, when you hear the logic, it makes total sense. But some of the, I was looking at the thread. So it was posted on Twitter. I know Twitter's not the best place necessarily, but they posted a video of Ian talking about the rationale behind the changes to Australian cricket. And then you look at the thread underneath and you see the vitriol thrown at him for this kind of proposal. And ostensibly because people just get hooked into tradition and this idea of, well, it was always like this, therefore it will always be great. And it doesn't really make any difference to them if you show them numbers around the people, leaving sport or leaving the sports experience, because it's just not as much fun. It doesn't make any difference. Facts that just don't matter. You can even appeal to them on an emotional level and just say, this is about having a great time and this, that, and the other, and they'll reject that. Say, no, it's not. It's about competition, winning, teaching kids the valuable lessons that they need. And then you're just left floundering because you've tried to appeal to them on a kind of factual theoretical argument side. You've then appealed to them on an emotional level. Nothing works. It's just, why are you ruining my world? You're just done for. It's a kind of crazy space.
Go away and become a climate change scientist. Like that's it's just, how do those guys feel? We're just talking about sport. Those guys are talking about stuff that get massive impact on the planet, and they still face opposition for whatever reason. It is fascinating, and you can say, we should do A, B, C, D, E. Why? Well, because science. Mm. Yeah, well, it's like, well, you can't. It's like, the motivations are always the thing, and motivations and incentives. Mm. What are the affordances that they're working with? Mm. And the Machiavellian thing where the people that are often most resistant to the change are the ones that are doing well in the current regime.
Sure.
So if I'm doing well, wait a minute, why would we want to? I'm all right at the minute, mate. Could you just this is why I don't want. Why do I want to make myself uncomfortable? It's only crazy people like us that think that that being uncomfortable causes growth or something. But it's difficult having those conversations. That being said, at different times chatting to parents and stuff, my daughter's team at the moment. A few of the parents, we played a game a few weeks ago. I had a couple of new players come in, and a few of the new parents said, "Oh, goodness me, why are they playing on such a big court? Why can't they make the hoops lower and things like?" And I'm going absolutely, I would love that to happen. So there are people out there that see it, but unfortunately, they're not always the ones that make the decisions.
So. Circling back to what we were talking about earlier on around the kind of constraints approach, just something I thought was of interest maybe. So as part of the day job working in coaching, we just made a kind of package of investment to an organisation in the UK called the Activity Alliance. They used to be known as the English Federation of Disability Sport, and they basically represent a range of different disability organisations. And one of the things that the reason we've invested in it is because actually it's to give them the capability to provide a kind of training package to coaches around inclusion. And so we have it's called the Inclusive Activity Program. And basically it's the idea of train about 8,500 coaches so that they can meet the needs of children with a range of different levels of ability. And the rationale is partially around disability sport, but it's also around, actually, it's just a kind of almost like a fundamental piece of learning that every coach almost should have, Richie, because you're likely to face young people, older people, adults, who've all got a range of limitations in terms of their physical capabilities, whether it's through injury or long-term health conditions or whatever it might be. And being able to adapt activity in order to meet their needs is kind of like almost like a fundamental learning point. And the likelihood is that over a period of time, that may well become almost like, one of the fundamental pieces of education that all coaches certainly in England, but hopefully potentially the UK, would undertake. But what's really interesting about it is the learning, the education, the course, if you like, the workshop, is based on principles of constraints. So they use the STEP model, space, task, equipment, people, as the kind of framework by which you can create adapted activity to meet the needs of individuals. And I immediately saw this thing and thought, how amazing is that, right? That's so. But this is kind of like really well understood and really well accepted in inclusion sport or disability sport. But what's really interesting is how difficult it's been, or it can be, to get people to embrace this as an idea in mainstream sport. And I'm like, I'm trying to work out what the kind of differences is. I don't know if you've had some similar experiences.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's well, like as we talked about at the top, your question, how did I get into this constraints-led approach stuff? Well, when you're coaching in an inclusive environment, be it physical, cognitive, whatever disability, you're constrained.
Yeah,
and you have to change, adapt, modify. You just have to figure it. You have to figure it out. You have to figure out what's going to meet the needs of the athlete. In many ways, it takes away possibly what would be the fundamental problem in mainstream sport, which is the coach-centered approach. Yeah. You can't be coach-centered. Well, you can try, but good luck. So in the sense, and it's interesting where, and I think a few of the guys you've had on have sort of mentioned it in the past, where they say you get the coaches of professional teams get put up on these pedestals and saying, oh, your team won, this and that and the other. You're a great coach. Come in and talk to all these coaches about how you do your thing and the thing and the what, and you run the drill and the plan and all of this. And really it's completely different to what the majority of coaches actually do or need. And I think if you have a coach of a professional team who's been a coach of a professional team for a while, and then stick them in front of a bunch of 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds, that can be very eye-opening for them. And the same thing if you put them in front of some athletes with disabilities of varying kinds. All of a sudden, it's like, how well do you know what you know? As opposed to you're doing a thing that you've done before and you think this will work. And a lot of, what I've seen with, so mainly my son, for better or for worse, has generally had me coaching him for most of the time he's been playing. However, managed to push him away and get him coached by a couple of different coaches at times. And his observations of that and his experiences of that, very, 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 very interesting. And he came to appreciate more the constraint sort of led approach as opposed to standing on lines and doing those sorts of things. It's very challenging. to get people to appreciate that. But that coach-centered stuff is the big thing. I think I wrote down a thing where, and it happens in teaching as well. As I was working in schools for 15, 20 years, and a big confusion. So if you ask people to paint what is a good or effective classroom, I think you were talking about the last pod you did, or the one before that, where this perception of what a coaching session should look like. The coaches, pointing and whistling and whatever, and everything's going with military precision. Well, you go, well, that's a great sort of session. Or you go into a classroom and all the kids are sitting down and writing, and everyone's busy and doing that. Well, that's a great classroom. There's all sorts of stuff going on there. But a big question we had the last organization I was with was, please don't mistake coaching, or in this case was teaching. Don't mistake teaching with control. It's not the same thing. Teaching and learning isn't control. And giving up a little bit of that control, I think, can be very powerful and very enlightening.
Fascinating stuff. One thing I wanted to talk to you about was, just sort of getting into the weeds of it really, around, I guess, sort of exploring activities that you might be doing with the different ages, and the sort of I guess, bringing it to life for people, because I think one of the things,
Yep.
We can talk quite conceptually about constraints and all that sort of stuff, and I think people grasp that. But I think one of the things people struggle with is to understand, like, the real how of it. So,
yeah.
I mean, can you walk me through some of that?
Yeah, for sure. Where should we start?
Good question. Maybe the last session you did, or what you've got planned for today, something like that.
Okay. So, yeah, sure. So, last stuff we did was at national team camp with I was with the Japanese ID women's team last session, and so there's some cultural differences here as well. So Japanese teams very, very disciplined. Everything's timed, or everything's organized and very, very structured. One of the key areas, especially with the intellectually impaired guys, is obviously decision making, and that's a big challenge point for all of the athletes, regardless of the sport. That decision making stuff, especially at speed, under pressure, when fatigued, that's what separates you. And what I was chatting to their coaches about, so we talk about that. We say, well, they go, the Japanese teams with basketball they're not very tall. However, they're quite fast and they're very disciplined. However, when you play faster, your decisions must be faster. They tend to make more decision errors, and also at speed, you can also make some skill errors, and you become more fatigued, etc., etc. So, my question with them was, well, how are you practicing decision making? To which there's, the buzzing of the insects in the background. It's like, yeah, we're not. They do a lot of on zero stuff. They're tremendously well conditioned. And so a lot of the stuff was just adding in defense to say, well, okay, how can you change this? Put some defense in, and now all of a sudden these athletes need to make some decisions. So at a most basic level, they'll just be doing some ball handling drills, dribbling and crossovers and change of direction stuff. And so I just added, we played a game that I play with, at a lot of levels actually. But it's a big favorite of my daughter's under-8s team. And we call it Buffaloes and Hippos, where the buffaloes are on one side of the river, the hippos are in the river, and the buffaloes want to charge across the river to get to the other side, but the hippos, of course, they own the river and they don't want to get them across to the other side. So the buffaloes have basketballs, the hippos are guarding the space, and they basically have to move and block and create an obstacle for the buffaloes. If the buffaloes mishandle, turn the ball over, whatever, they become hippos. And then you adjust the space to make it easier or harder, and then you adjust the number of buffaloes and hippos. to make it easier and harder. And so all of a sudden we just say, okay, you know what a buffalo is? Yes, buffalo's charge. You're a hippo. You've got to get your big hippo backside between yourself and the buffalo, which is the basics of defense, and then charge away. And so out of that, then the dribblers are responding to whatever the defense is doing. The defense is having to respond to multiple inputs of who we're going to stop and how we're going to do it. And then you throw in a couple of questions to the buffaloes and the hippos. So hippos, there's this many of you and there's this many of the buffaloes. You know, what's your advantage? What's their advantage? You know, and then you talk about what do animals do in the wild? You know, they pick off the weakest one. I say, okay, so that kid over there who's got great handles and is the fastest kid on the team, maybe leave them till last. You know, and pick on the slowest one or the one that the easiest one, and and so you build all sorts of teamwork things and games and ways around that. So that's sort of a basic one. What else do we do?
Did you use, as a matter of interest, so taking the buffaloes and hippos idea, did you use that language with this group, or did you play it in a different way?
Call the buffaloes and hippos. Yeah.
Great, and they responded really well.
Yeah. So I mean, my Japanese isn't. I mean, I can sort of get by, but it's not tremendous. You know, it's not. I'm not. We're not discussing global politics or anything. So, being able to use language that sort of gives them some imagery to work with is really, really helpful. And then all that, and all the stuff about feedback and stuff around it, where imagery tends to be more effective. External distal stuff, being more effective. All that action perception podcast stuff. That's quite beneficial, I think. I mean, and that's with the under eights, that was definitely very, very powerful. And one of the things they love about that, it being a game, and they can go, oh, I'm a big hippo, and I've got to get in the way and stop the thing. So yeah, same stuff. And the athletes enjoy it, and these girls are. These girls are like 18, 19, 20, up to 25 years of age. So,
and their experiences in terms of. So, I mean, I'm assuming the main theme of that game is focused around. There's some elements of defensive cohesion and kind of teamwork in defense and those sorts of things.
Communication. Yeah.
But primarily, I think you're trying to you're creating a scenario where. It's about ball handling, is that correct? So it's essentially dribbling and evasion and those sorts of concepts. Yeah. So it's a gross mode. Can you change direction? Can you take the ball with you? And and being able to operate in a confined space under pressure. Yeah. And if they're very used to the. By the way, it took me a little while to work out what on zero meant, but you unopposed, I'm assuming.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, like 3 on 0. Yeah, okay, I get it. So I was thinking then as well, so they would typically have done a lot of stuff where they would do a lot of handling drills, exercises where there's very little opposition, but it's a lot of handling. So if they're very used to that and that's their comfort level, you've come along with this crazy buffaloes and hippos thing. What was the response? Was there initially a little bit of resistance? Was there a little bit of, what's this all about and that kind of stuff? Because I'm thinking, you're working against linguistic constraints, cultural constraints, behavioral constraints, and there's some habit. And this happens, I think, resonates for a lot of coaches who are transitioning from a, kind of more kind of coach-centered, linear approach to coaching, trying to use non-linear approaches, but struggling to get the athletes to buy into it because it's so alien to them. I mean, you must have had this kind of very magnified, I guess, in this experience, or not. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, the girls are the girls are gorgeous. Like, they're beautifully polite. Like, okay, but then they approach it and they just start really, really tentatively. It helps that their coaches are on board with wanting to learn and try different stuff. So then all of a sudden they're like, no, go as hard as you can. And then after a while they're like, oh, okay. And then once they put some intensity into it, and they go, oh, this is actually not bad, and they can start to play and enjoy it. I mean, other basic games I've done, did with a middle school over here. It was interesting. It was girls and boys practicing. So the girls, they'll maybe sort of age, middle school here is maybe sort of 13 to 15 years of age. So we put them all together. I said, okay, here's a ball. Half of you over here, half of you, you split the teams up, girls and boys. And then you play a very basic game where it's like your team makes 10 passes in a row, you score a point. And the other team, you've just got to take the ball off them. It's just that simple. And then they just sort of look at each other and you go, okay, the game goes for a minute, go. And they just sort of all look at each other, and then one person passes the ball, and the hesitancy was really, really interesting. And that took, with those guys, it took 5 or 10 minutes to break that down. So first of all, there was a thing of, what is this game? What are we doing? This could be a little bit embarrassing. Where's the camera, sort of thing. Then there was, okay, we'll try this out. And they started passing. But then there was the girls and boys were mixed on a team. And then that was uncomfortable. And so the boys were passing to the boys, and then the girls would pass to the girls, and the girls would sort of end up clustered in one area and the boys would end up clustered in the other. So then we go, okay, well, how can let's put in another, okay. So you can't, if you're a boy, you got to pass to a girl. If you go, you got to pass to a boy. So it's got to go girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy. So then that sort of started to unlock that. And so that was a really interesting experience there. So it was all of the cultural stuff. As well as this isn't how we've done this before. I'm not quite sure about this. That was quite interesting.
And so initially, let's say with any of these different game forms, working with a group of athletes who are finding this really quite new, one of the things I also imagine takes place is there's a lot of error. There's a lot of breakdown of skill, because all these different informational variables are coming at them, and so therefore they can't attend to the two things at once, and all those two challenges. And for a lot of individuals, that's quite uncomfortable and quite challenging. So did you experience that? Secondly, how do you then manage that in terms of the athletes becoming more comfortable with the failure?
Yeah, sure. I think massive. What I've had with this is where getting athletes that are new or haven't been conditioned in other ways is tremendously beneficial, because the fear of making mistakes is tremendously real. But this is common not just in the sporting coaching landscape, but also in education, where you need to work. When we were doing the teaching and learning improvement stuff, one of the most important things, one of the most valuable things you can do is set up the space so that everyone within that learning space feels safe, so that they can make mistakes. And all the research about brain development and learning points to one of the highest priorities of the human brain is to feel safe. If the human brain doesn't feel safe for whatever reason, it will struggle to learn. They know that for kids. It's why low socioeconomic, obviously difficult circumstances contribute significantly to impaired learning. And so being able to create that, and I think really the only way to do that is to build effective relationships with the athletes so that they trust you, and really be very careful about how and when you intervene and give feedback, to ensure that you're constantly sending the correct signal that, yes, I want you to go at this 100%. And if you make a mistake, that's okay. We'll try and you try and figure that out. Have another few turns at it. Then if there's a consistent problem there that you can't solve, sort of on your own, then we'll get some support in from some other place. Pair you up with another athlete. Like in the classroom, for instance, you might pair a kid up with another student to work through some stuff. You do the same thing, on a field or a court, or with other coaches that can support them. And that was, and again, the culture stuff with the Japanese guys, that they want to be doing the right thing all the time.
Yeah.
That's a very big social pressure for them across the whole society. Make sure you're fitting in and doing things and not being out of place, and making sure everything's going smoothly. So putting them in uncomfortable situations and saying it is okay to make a mistake. This is new, and the mantra that we have with all the teams, definitely had with the national team guys, was that you are. We possibly used slightly different words, but you are rubbish at something the first time you do it. You're always rubbish at something the first time you do it. And like when you first tried to walk, what happened? But with practice and refinement, eventually you'll be able to figure that out. And that's that emotional level, dialing that in. And it can be helpful to flag that with athletes beforehand. We used to always have, we talk about the emotional, the cognitive, and the physical dials, and how you manage those. We would flag, you flag with athletes. Okay, this is shoulders up, so this is going to be cognitively demanding. Okay, this is hips down, so this is going to be, physically demanding. Or this one's. This is a chest one, this one. So this is going to test your heart or your emotions and how well you can cope with that. Heart and head. Can you think your way through this? Can you make sure that your frontal lobes can control the lizard brain, as it were? All of these frustrations that are coming to the fore. Can you just go, okay, I'm going to let them sit and stew there for a minute? No pun intended.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to sit with that frustration, and hopefully I can work through it. And then on the other side of that, I might be able to see some improvement. Flagging that, I think, is helpful for the athlete, so they know it's coming. I mean, especially with some of the ID guys, if they're on the autistic spectrum, if they know it's coming, unexpected stuff can really, those cortisol levels start shooting through the roof really quickly for them. So flagging that's coming, you go, this is going to be hard for these reasons. This is what we're working on, and this is why. You will feel this emotional response when it gets hard. That's okay. That's normal. But we need to get better at handling that for, these sorts of reasons.
I was going to ask you that actually about. So whether ID athletes are more accustomed to struggle, failure, challenge, because that's something they've had to cope with through most of their lives, or are they like slightly more perfectionist in nature and find it very frustrating when there's error or failure? So, for example, just reflecting this morning, my son is dyslexic and has always struggled with his reading, and he copes with it in various different ways. But one of the ways, interestingly, one of the things I've noticed is, so this morning it's the end of term, it's the last day of term, and he was doing a card for his teacher saying, "Thank you very much for teaching me," and he, on the front of the card, he's doing a drawing, and he prides himself on his drawing because that's an area where he has success.
He can excel.
Exactly.
Yep.
And he did a drawing that he didn't think was good enough. And he came in, tears in his eyes. This is a rubbish drawing. He'd done it in pen, so he couldn't change it. And he wasn't prepared to adapt. He was just, it's like, it's rubbish and I'm done it and all that sort of stuff. And it's like this sort of perfectionist tendency. So I guess that's where that question's coming from, is, do you see both of those things, or and kind of challenging, how do you manage it?
So I think it's a good way of looking at it is about identity, and if you if part of your identity is part of the the growth mindset stuff, if your identity is tied to just doing something very, very well, that can become problematic, because at some stage you will encounter something that either, as in the case of your son, you'll produce something, but it won't, for whatever reason, you got distracted halfway through, someone bumped the table or whatever. It's didn't turn out exactly the way you wanted to. And if your sense of identity is tied up with, no, this is what I do and this is who I am, and it doesn't measure up, that becomes problematic. And all the Carol Dweck stuff, all that growth mindset thing is obviously around, the brain plasticity stuff, which is, okay, that may not be as good as I want, but who I am is someone that looks at this as, as constant improvement, as opposed to everything being, a finished product sort of thing. And so, and that's where that getting comfortable with making mistakes is so tremendously valuable, because you can't escape it. The moment you're born, you're making mistakes. The point is, I guess, that how do you respond to that? And your response to that is the important stuff. Are you resilient enough to cope with that, physically, cognitively, emotionally? And so with the ID athletes, it is a problem, especially at the elite level. So, because as you point out, so for these guys, so a lot of stuff is difficult for them, and they can be marginalized in certain ways, obviously. And, school can be difficult, social stuff can be difficult and so on. Yet with the elite guys, here is a domain where they have been successful. And they have, and people have said, you know what, you're really good at that, and pat them on the back. And so they get lots of good feedback, and feel a sense of pride and all that sort of stuff around those sorts of things. So when they then come to national team camp, for instance, for the first time, we say to them, okay, you are really, really good at this thing that you've been doing, because you've made it here. However, chances are, because we're not the best in the world, there are actually there are teams that are better than us. So you've got to be ready to lose. You've got to be ready for the challenge. You've got to be ready to be knocked down and have to pick yourself up and sort of go again. And so, all, throughout the whole program is this thing of like, can you provide enough emotional challenge for them so that they can, ride that out and weather those storms. With the state team, when I first started with the state men's team a number of years ago, so Victorian state men's team was very dominant. Had most of the best athletes, won the gold medals most of the times at nationals. So there were a lot of the guys there that hadn't really lost a game for a while. So I felt it was quite important for them to actually feel what it was like to struggle.
Yeah.
Just to put them back in a thing of like, okay, you're pretty good. Like, obviously in this particular space, in this domain, you're doing very, very well. However, could you improve? Is it okay for us just to stay where we are? Because there's only one way to coast, and that's downhill. So I'd enter into mainstream tournaments with some juniors, and the game would be faster. So some of our guys are a bit older, so they'd be bigger, and some of them would be bigger and stronger, but they're not as fast, and their decision making is not as good. So they'd be put under a lot of pressure, and they'd lose some games. And for a few of them, that was new, but it made them more resilient. It helped us emotionally, and you continue to improve. So that stuff's important, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it's just extra layers of complexity, isn't it? But what I think is really interesting about this is the more I think about the context you're working in. And so I suppose there's probably a lot of people out there that think that are thinking, you know, about the challenges of working with, you know, intellectually impaired athletes. But interestingly, the more I think about it, the more actually this applies to any context, you know, a kind of a mainstream context or a non-disabled context, because, you know, I'm thinking about the kids I'm coaching tonight in cricket, and they've all got different they've all got different abilities. Some of that's linked to maturation, some of it's linked to, you know, kind of developmental age, some of it's linked to their, you know, kind of relative age in terms of their year group. Some of it's to do with experience. You know, some of them have got older brothers and they've been playing in the garden forever, and therefore they have a slightly better developmental, you know, training age, if you like. And they've all got different kind of capabilities. Some are clearly, you know, from a coordination standpoint, stronger than others, and this, that, and the other. So mixing that group up and trying to meet all their different needs is a constant. I'm not going to say it's a challenge. It's just something that I'm very mindful of all the time to make sure that each of them can have as valuable an experience as is possible. I mean, one of the things I definitely do there is disregard age altogether, because ultimately we need to make sure that they're going to be able to sort of work together and compete together and enjoy things together, particularly in a training context. And also making them understand as well from the outset, not making them understand, getting them to understand that when we're in our practice scenario, that's when we're in our learning space. So that's where, and struggle is inextricably linked with learning. And therefore, we need to see that kind of stuff. I had a really interesting challenge with a young player last week who, you know, it came down to the final ball, and it was the older boys against the younger boys for a bit of fun, but with some modified rules to sort of equal it up for the younger boys. Yeah. The younger boys won. It was a fantastic shot that this little boy, I mean, he's got this big lad running in, steaming in as fast as he can, and he decides to just play this beautiful little cut shot because he knew he couldn't hit it hard enough, so he just cut it and went for 4. They won the game, and the guy who's bowling, like, he just lost it because, you know, oh yeah, this was unfair. I was like, yeah. So what are we learning now? And he was like, he looked at me and he was a bit like, yeah, but whatever. But I just knew at that moment that, you know, this was going to be a good space for him to develop.
Yeah, it's like, so for him, what is it? He expected to win. For whatever reason, because I was older, bigger, stronger, I see myself as being more skilled. So therefore, my expectation is that I'm going to win. My expectation wasn't met. So then I have an adverse emotional response. So what's to be learned? Well, are your expectations realistic? And if your expectations aren't met, is your response appropriate?
Yeah.
You know, like, I mean, at a basic sense, we talk about, you know, you talk about the guys, like with the young guys, you go up to a kid in the playground and say, hey, do you want to play? You know, you want to come and play with me? And they go, oh no. Now, if you're expecting them to say yes, you can have an adverse emotional response. You go, oh, that's terrible, whatever. But if you go, well, they might say no, but for all sorts of different reasons, and that's okay because they've got reasons.
Yeah.
If my expectations are more matched and appropriate to whatever that situation is, you know, the emotional responses can be more manageable. So, yeah, that's the thing of, like, you know, did you expect to beat the guys, or why is that? Why do you expect to beat them all the time? Yeah, maybe they're not, you know, maybe it's a little bit harder than you thought.
And I also, like, there's that part of me as well that thinks that the, you know, that struggle element is, he's he's the best player, or him and they're the best. They're used to being the best players. They're used to always being successful. Interestingly enough, both of them went to the next representative level and haven't progressed. And so a part of me is reflecting on, partly that might be to do with the fact that you do certain things because you can do so as the best player amongst this group. Interesting, just as an aside, I tried to promote them. They can be a little bit disruptive because they're not always, they're certainly not empathetic with other younger players or players of lesser ability, and can be, so I'm constantly talking to them about things like leadership and and how they support their teammates and all these sorts of things. But I actually tried to promote them up and said, right, I think you need to be playing with the under-13s, because actually this is a good challenge point. Neither of them wanted to. They wanted to stay in the comfort zone of being with their friendship group. I get that, the social group, totally understand that, and that's a big part of it. So therefore, fine. But it was really interesting just to reflect, and it's something I'm going to have to think about going forward, is actually there needs to be a stretch point for these individuals.
Do you think they, what sort of feedback do you think they have had from other sources around their performance? What sort of feedback do they generally receive, do you think?
I think it's generally very focused on, I think both of them are, the whole idea of contingent self-worth. So their personality is very wrapped around their performance as a sportsman. They're both, highly capable and quite gifted at a range of different sports, probably the best in their school, generally speaking. They receive adulation from all their peers, their school, their parents, everything else. So wanting to be on that pedestal, you can understand, can't you? It's really difficult to pull yourself out of that and go and be just an average Joe in a different side and have to really struggle and develop. And it's a piece I've got to work on. I've only really picked them up again this year, and they'll leave me again as an age group next year. But it's something I need to address somehow around. I think it'll be a significant limiter to them on their potential. But it's a real challenge, isn't it? Because there is, I have limited contact with these individuals, and are all around them societally. They are just bombarded with messages about what you do is who you are. Your results in certain circumstances dictate how you are viewed by the rest of society, and it's kids. I mean, it's no surprise there's an epidemic of mental health issues, certainly over here, and I think in most Western societies, because it's just being amplified by the device in their hands. But it's also just a kind of a constant bombardment of your achievement is who you are and your value to the world, and I just think it's very dangerous.
Yeah, it's what they in the education space, if you've got image maintenance, they call it. So, and studies have indicated that it can take as little as 15 minutes for people to go into an image maintenance mode, and that's and all of that comes back to feedback. All the John Hattie stuff for people who are in teaching and education around what makes the most difference to teaching and learning, what has the largest effect size, and feedback, appropriate and timely feedback is it. But that the constant, I think they've shown, I can't remember who did the study. I'd have to go back and look it up. Where if you get a group of people and say, oh, you're smart. You're very smart. Look at what you can do. You're very good at that. And then, so you give them an easy task and say how smart they are. You must be very smart and intelligent because you can do that very, very well.
Yeah.
And then with another group, you give them a more difficult task and go, oh, wow, you're working so hard on that. Look how long you're sticking on that task, and you've tried all sorts of different ways of solving that. Yeah. I think if you keep that up, you'll be able to succeed. And then if you then switch the tasks, the image maintenance group, who are both groups, the guys that were told that they were really, really smart spend significantly less time on a more difficult task, because they see that, oh, if I spend more time on this, it will look like I'm not that smart. They've just told me I'm really smart, so I might just stop doing that task. So task avoidance becomes the priority, rather than trying to tackle it and solve and try to learn something out of solving that problem. But as you say, if you got the athletes once a week, if parents, friends, whatever in there is going like, oh, well done, Johnny or whoever, you've done that really, you're really good and your team won, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then that's the image that they get programmed with. And I think all around the world in all sorts of different sports, there's a number of athletes that suffer from that. You see athletes who either their career ends prematurely through injury, or when they retire, and all of a sudden their identity that is now on shaky ground.
Yeah.
Because who I was what I was doing, and now I'm no longer doing that. And that's a huge problem.
Yeah. Wow, we have covered some ground today. Simon, I've enjoyed every second of this conversation. I'd love to talk to you for longer. Sadly, I have a couple of deadlines to meet today, so I'm going to have to sign off. But hey, listen, I think the work you're doing is amazing, and I love the fact that you're still in that kind of learning and exploratory phase yourself. You're embracing that constraints model, and obviously, doing so because like you say, you work with an audience group that you absolutely have to be, player or athlete centered, because otherwise you're just not going to have. You're not going to be in effect. Your effectiveness as a coach is going to be compromised considerably, and also it's you're very mindful of the fact that those people have those individual needs. So it makes it very front and center, and I think there's some really valuable lessons to be learned around. Even in that kind of mainstream context, that all of these kids are individuals, and therefore they deserve to be given that kind of support, which is again one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this particular methodology, if you like, or way of viewing human learning, human development, because it gives us the scope to do that. It's not putting people in boxes and say you must do this, you must do that. Sorry, I'm ranting on. Is there a means by which people can reach out to you if they wanted to, kind of just ask some questions, get some clarifications, understand a little bit more?
I'm not. Email would probably be the best way if they wanted to do that. I'm Coach Robbo, 2 B's, at me.com. I'm not particularly active. I'm a bit of a stalker on social media, not particularly active, at least not at this stage. Perhaps that's something I could rectify. But email would be the best way at this stage.
Great stuff. All right, brilliant. Listen, like I said, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your experiences. I hope the rest of your time in Japan goes well. It sounds to me like you're having a load of fun, they're having a load of fun, and there's a whole bunch of learning going on at the same time, which to me sounds like an ideal model.
Having a lot of fun. I think it's either the hottest or close to the hottest summer on record here at the moment. So it's hot work, but yeah, it's fun work. It's enjoyable for sure.
Well, I feel your pain. We're currently, it won't be as hot, but we're currently enduring a period of hot weather like I've only experienced probably in my childhood. So we're basking in it over here in the UK, and I don't want to jinx it by the minute I talk about it, probably the rain will come down. But anyway, I feel your pain. Like I said before, really appreciate you coming on, and all the best for everything you're doing now and in the future.
Thank you, Stuart. My pleasure, and it was an honour to be on. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.